Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to NYLON, our City Dialogue event that we hold with New York twice each year. And welcome to our audiences watching in London, New York, and guests all over the world. So at NLA, we recently published a digital research paper called Work London. And it was about whether or not we have had an office revolution over the last few months, and it documents how workspaces across the city have evolved, adjusting to the pandemic, and how they'll need to adapt for the future. So today we wanted to discuss with New York what the office will look like and how it will be used in the future, and also how these changes will impact public life in global commercial districts. And here, it'd be really good to share some current thinking with New York today. So at this point, I'd just like to thank all our collaborators, the Centre for Architecture, Urban Design Forum, and our champions, ACOM, KPF, U&I, and our supporters, View City. And as usual, we'll be having a Q&A at the end, so please do make sure you post your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So now to start off proceedings, I'd like to welcome my good friend Benjamin Prosky, who's Executive Director at the Centre for Architecture, AIA-NY, to provide some context in New York. So Ben, over to you.
Peter, great to see you and great to see everyone. Thank you all for being here, and I really think that this conversation couldn't be more timely. Just thinking about it a bit, pre-pandemic workplaces were evolving. I hope we can remember that, right? There was co-working, there was hot desking as an idea. Even some of the people on this call have been really looking at quality of life in the workplace. And what the workplaces were like, right? Businesses understood that qualities in the workplace or quality of life in the workplace was an important thing. But actually many new questions have arisen, right? Can a good quality workplace compete with the comforts of home? Can we manage these hybrid connections, right? Actually having people in two different places makes it much more technically challenging. So can we manage the tech and space issues that can design really help us do this? Can developers and building owners really take this to another level? And I think this is really the right time to look into it. There's also this fear that we will let this moment pass. Will muscle memory kick in, right? Will we all be forced back in and just sort of do the things that we used to do because it's easier? And I think lastly, just to consider, just this morning here in New York, listening to National Public Radio, there were several different reports on returning to the workplace, but they actually had to do less with sort of the difficulties of working in the workplace, but actually the social dynamics of the workplace, right? Some people of color in America were talking about how actually not being in the workplace and not having bullying and other dynamics has made working from home even better for their productivity and emotional well-being. So I think that this is a heavy order to address all these things, but these are the discussions that we will be having, and we'll be looking at how design and tech and physical space and social dynamics all come together. So again, with Peter, I want to join and thank the NLA, and I want to thank Urban Design Forum and our collaborators who've been so marvelous, and our speakers from down the road from me, but far away, and also across the world. So Peter, back to you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. Well, yes, managing technical issues, key thing. I was supposed to be on a conference just before this with Otis. They had a global conference, and I couldn't get on. And anyway, it turns out there was some massive global outage on the internet this morning, but hopefully for us it's now been corrected because everything seems to be working fine between us. So now to provide an introduction to the discussion, Programme Champions, KPF, will give us some reflections on both cities, where of course they have offices both here and in New York. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Marianne Kwok, who's a director at KPF. Over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for attending. KPF is so pleased to sponsor the theme today. It's so important for us. Bill Pedersen has called the office the building block of the city. And the office is so important to our work, not only as specifically the typology, but also how it factors into our mixed-use projects and our transit-oriented development projects. And so it's really hard to separate the idea of the urban realm without talking about the office space and the city and impactful urban architecture. So we've been looking at this idea of the future of the office for the last 10 or 15 years. And this last 18 months has really fast forwarded that discussion and all the factors of sustainability, resilience, links to transportation, activation of the public realm, surrounding green spaces, connection to the exterior air quality, technology, densification, collaboration, social spaces, all the items that Ben has talked about. This period has really kind of reset and has enabled us to perhaps take this opportunity to address those issues in a more intense way, but also to look at ideas about equity and life-work balance with a hybrid work model. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the speakers this morning and learning more. As everyone is starting this return to the workplace, I think our futures are all very much tied to how these apps for hybrid working will unfold. So very much looking forward to this morning. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Marianne. And now to set the scene for the discussion, we'll have two architects presenting, one from London, one from New York, talking about the future design of the workplace. And so we're going to start with London. And first we have Nick Gaskell, who is the partner and workplace sector lead at Hawkins Brown Architects. Nick, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. So like everyone, we've been grappling for the last year with sort of an enormous upheaval and trying to understand the pandemic fallout. And it's clear that there are obviously needs that are unique to the pandemic and that they're more likely to be sort of short-term needs, short-term trends. And there are other trends that were already happening to a certain degree. So the pandemic has massively accelerated. So in that sense, I agree with sort of previous speakers that the most meaningful lasting impact of the pandemic is as a kind of accelerator that has brought the future forward far more quickly. And we have to be agile to adapt to that level of change. So for the next few slides, I'm going to share a few observations and illustrate them with the projects we've been working on and are working on in and around London. So it's clear we still crave communal experience. This is sort of part of our nature as humans, and communal workspace should be part of that. But what we can see is that for many organizations, presenteeism is coming to an end, and good riddance in my book. So our time that was previously spent at a desk should now be spread out. And not just at home, but ideally across the buildings, the campuses and the cities that we work within. So this is the new agile working. So one potential consequence of that is that during midweek, say Tuesday to Thursday, workspaces could be full, but on other days they might be fairly empty. So how can we make sure that buildings are used throughout the week in a way that justifies their carbon cost and makes a positive contribution to the city? So something we push for quite hard in lots of buildings that we're working on is a much more generous ground floor volume that can accommodate more public uses, retail, cultural events, and so on. So we're seeing a combination of cultural uses and workspace in a way that allows evening and weekend events, and it's something that invites the wider community in, but also helps to enrich working life for building tenants. And there are other ways to hybridize. So the ways that emphasize that workplace isn't just about office space. It can obviously be about catering for a much broader set of activities and tenants. So sometimes with very different use patterns and priorities, but all within the same building or campus. So we see a huge diversification of what we mean when we talk about workplace. An example of this that we've completed is at Here East. It's a project we've been designing over the last decade since the London Olympics, and it transformed the Olympic broadcast and press centres into a 1.2 million square foot tech campus. And the trick here was to combine scales and sectors that don't often come together, and then promote opportunities for collaboration that wouldn't otherwise exist. So our role was to sort of rethink existing structures to create a kind of anticipatory infrastructure that could flex the tenant needs. So one of the interesting things was to see the emergence of unexpected sectors within the campus. So particularly cultural institutions like the V&A Museum, who are currently sort of fitting out a space at the southern end of the broadcast centre. Another example of hybridization is the rise of lab-enabled office space. So we've used our experience across the higher education and workplace sectors to conduct a piece of research into how we cater for the life sciences in particular. And this is obviously partly in response to space demands for this sector as a result of the pandemic. And it includes studies looking at both sort of new build and retrofit solutions. So again, mixing sectors and uses like this can sort of cater for a need, but it also creates buildings that are better used. So how else can we better use structures? I mean, there's clearly a need to sort of rethink existing workspaces. And this is something that has to happen as we respond to changing work patterns. But there's also the chance to take on non-workspace structures and repurpose them. So in some ways, I think this might offer better opportunities to respond more radically to the changes that we're talking about. I mentioned Here East. There's another couple of images looking at Here East. This is a project you'd be very unlikely to build from scratch. But it's successful for that very reason. And that's because it offers huge studio space alongside office space in a way they can't find elsewhere. And a lot of larger tenants have taken space here because it involves that sort of range of scales that's almost unique to sort of central London. And we've seen this trend continue as we work on other large-scale structures. So this is the Printworks, an emerging proposal within British Land's Canada Water Master Plan. And it again uses opportunities of volume and scale to create a kind of functionality and character that you can't find elsewhere. So if you think about the internal workspaces themselves, what we're seeing is that if you want to sit at a desk and click away at your mouse or your keyboard, you can just stay at home. So if you're in the office, you want to be able to do something different, and you want to be able to engage with other people. We're looking at a lot of large-scale fit-out projects for clients like local government, who are looking to reevaluate how they work. So before we start designing even, we spend a lot of time understanding their work patterns and how they want to change. And again, this is something that was happening pre-pandemic, but we're seeing this accelerating more and more. And interestingly, London councils in particular are pretty forward-thinking when it comes to rethinking their working practices. So this means we design spaces that are specifically tailored to particular activities. And the pattern that we're finding more and more is that for a given number of occupants, we're factoring in fewer individual desks, fewer workstations, but more collaboration space and more amenity space. So we've seen the emphasis between these areas kind of shifting significantly over the past year or two. And then when we start to spatialize this, there's a move away from traditional fixed seating, but this doesn't necessarily mean just a kind of free-form hot desking solution. We talk a lot about creating a series of neighborhoods with some flexibility within those zones. So it creates a kind of interaction across the sort of institutional business, but it keeps some meaningful contact between the teams that are working together. And it also moves away from siloed communal facilities and locates them across the space, across the building, in a way that encourages people to move. Decentralization. I mean, moving space out of the city centre is obviously a hot topic. I think you know, for a lot of big cities in the context of the pandemic. One opportunity we're seeing is the sort of reevaluation of out-of-town business parks in particular. In the UK, at least, these are sort of much maligned. They're outdated. They're unsustainable, car dependent. But what we can see is that there are amazing opportunities to rethink what these business parks could be. So these are opportunities to create you know, more sustainable transport connections, cyclist facilities, car share, electric vehicle facilities, and so on. But more than that, there's a chance to make something much more out of the potential for a healthy connection to the surrounding landscape. So we're looking at several projects where we retain existing business park buildings, but transform them through selective interventions, which might be recladding to create a new identity and better thermal performance, or it might be a transformation of an atrium to provide new meeting spaces. And then we take opportunities to offer all the facilities that you don't have at home. So, you know, there's and you don't have you know, space for in central London as well. So, you know, from better cycling facilities to gyms to outdoor cinema and so on. And if we think a little bit more about healthy buildings, unsustainability is another sort of trend that's been accelerated by the pandemic. This is our emerging proposal for Brent Cross Town for Argent Related, and our building sits between the new square and park. And we wanted to think about how we could create a healthy environment in a meaningful way. And part of that, I think, is to give mental health equal billing with physical health. So how do you use natural materials, biophilia, easy access to the open air, a better relationship with daylight and diurnal rhythms, and so on, to make a workplace that people feel uplifted by. When it comes to timber structures, this is something we're doing more and more of. This proposal is a sort of full timber structure, and it not only reduces our embodied carbon, but it sort of promotes positive mental health, we think, for the occupants inside. We think there's another opportunity for sort of rethinking an old approach, which is for a kind of new version of the 70s Bürolandschaft design movement. And this is a version that would focus on engaging with nature. So it'd move away from the sort of artificial, machine-led, binary and sort of standardized, and become biophilic, landscape-led, circadian and climate responsive. So how would that play out? Well, you know, ideally it would mean taller ceilings, better daylight, user control of windows, promotion of biophilia. But it could also mean, you know, pavilions that provide collaboration space within a green rooftop landscape, you know, connected by walking routes that allow moments for privacy and contemplation. So just a couple more slides. The final thought, I think, you know, we could build the most technically competent, well-resolved workspaces, but ultimately we have to inspire people to unplug themselves from their home workstations. So there's this overriding need to create workplaces that offer something truly different and uplifting, and remind people why we have communal workspace in the first place. So we can no longer get away with just doing something that's, you know, just okay. It has to be something sort of truly special to get over any potential inertia. So to wind up, yes, you know, what we're seeing is, you know, enormous upheaval, but with upheaval is, you know, huge opportunity. And personally, I can see a lot to get excited about over the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. And now we'll hear from Richard Cook, who's founding partner of Cook Fox in New York. Rick, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone. Nick, that was a great presentation, and you'll see that there are many similarities from London to New York. My name is Rick Cook, and this is our studio, and I show a picture of our studio, the outdoor space. Our studio has 3 outdoor terraces that we envisioned as an integral part of the workplace, filed on the plans, exit signs, Wi-Fi connection, this idea that the workplace was evolving way before the pandemic. So the big picture is, why do we go to the office? What are we going to do now, and what changed? So I think context is important. And the next one, please. The context is that we started out on this path about 2 decades ago. I like this image because it shows the classic iconic workplace of Manhattan, the Empire State Building. This idea that we collaborate, we're dense, and cities are good because we densely collaborate. The building on the right with the spire is a building called the Condé Nast Building, or 4 Times Square at the time that it was built by the Durst family. And that was called our first green skyscraper, commercial skyscraper. And we had the blessing to design the building right next door called the Bank of America One Bryant Park. And I bring this up because the workplace was evolving and we were talking about environmental responsibility. So it had 4.6 megawatts on-site power generation, radically reducing carbon output, reducing the water usage 50%, and a whole series of other things. But the real change, what really happened when we were trying to make buildings better for the planet, and it's kind of funny, we were late to the game in New York, admittedly, and we were late to our European friends. But when we came into it with a passion. And the Durst family had this idea about stewardship. And stewardship is a really important concept, that you are the steward of a rich resource and you have a responsibility to leave it to the next generation better. But skyscrapers are fun when they meet the sky. It's how they meet the ground that's also really important. And what we stumbled onto when we were trying to make buildings better for the planet was that we could make buildings quantifiably better for people. Okay, so the next one, please. Ultimately, this building has to come down to the ground. One of the hardest things is to bring a skyscraper to the ground. The next one, please, Kat. So this is the corner of 42nd and 6th. The building lives and breathes off the infrastructure of a vibrant city. It lives and breathes off the mass transit infrastructure and walking distance from mass transit. It's 2.2 million square feet without a single parking space. If you say that in Atlanta or Florida in the United States, people gasp, like, where will people park? Directly across the street is One Bryant Park, the most used park by visitor trip in all of the United States. If we parked at the rate they park in North Carolina at their headquarters, we'd have to cover Bryant Park with an 8-story parking garage. So the answer isn't, what's the greenest thing about the building, isn't some whiz-bang technology. It's that it lives and breathes off mass transit. So when we talk about place and reinforcing the city, the next image that's coming up is a building that we were working on at the exact same time, fundamentally different scale. It was repurposing a crazy old building in the meatpacking district, and it's now known as the Apple Building. But this was a building that also set a standard for the value of office space. Yet it wasn't iconic on the skyline. It was all about how it met the ground. And the next image is the Penthouse. This was the highest price ever paid for office space south of 42nd Street. And there's a giant sign cutting through the one corner office. But it brought up this issue that people want to be part of a place. When you walk to the edge of this parapet, you look down on the meatpacking district. You get to walk outside, you have optionality. And it brings up this issue of the importance of connecting to nature. And we were on this way before the pandemic. And now it's kind of nice. I'm at my home right now. I'm looking out at trees all around me. This is something that I think people need to reduce the stress of the work environment. Connecting to nature literally lowers your cortisol levels, lowers your stress response. So this body of work we call Biophilic Design, which Nick referenced. The next one, please. These are 2 white papers that are available for download from our sister firm, Terrace Bright Green, but the 14 patterns of biophilic design. I won't go into it in my short time this morning, but please go, and all of this information is available. There are quantifiable impacts that we can have on human health by the way that we design. Okay, the next one, please. We have the opportunity to design a building right next to the High Line. And the High Line was one of the most remarkable breakthroughs for us as New Yorkers. We are very proud of it. And this idea that you can walk on a repurposed rail infrastructure and walk through the city and never stop at the cross streets, or stop when you're on the High Line and look up and down the cross streets in a unique way across the Manhattan grid. Or this area just up to the left here on this picture is called the Chelsea Thicket. When I first walked the High Line to get ready to design this building, the loudest thing I heard were crickets on 22nd Street in Manhattan. So we wanted a building that would exist on and of the High Line. The next one, please. So this is the view from the High Line. There's a little amphitheater here where they show movies at night. And we wanted a building that you were both in and on. This idea that the workplace couldn't be a sealed skyscraper. It needed to be this building that had optionality and flexibility. And the next one is a detail from the staircase that goes from the 4th floor. Right off to your right here in this image is the Chelsea thicket that I was talking about. And the staircase actually has an outdoor circulation that goes from the 4th floor to the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor. So you can be both on the building and in the building and adjacent to the High Line. This idea that the workplace isn't a sealed box that we lay out desks in interesting ways, but it's a place that engages with nature and engages with the city. And then at the roof, the next one, people love to feel connected to an authentic place. And I like this image because it brings up our iconic Empire State Building again. But the roof is no longer a tar beach, but it's a reconstituted ground plane. It's a park for everybody in the building. So as Nick mentioned earlier, this idea of amenities in the workplace becomes extremely important. So how could a workplace possibly be better than working from home? No commute, get to look out at nature wherever your home is. The next series of images are actually an opportunity where we had to design our own office that I started with in the beginning. This is our own office when you arrive. The installation here is by an artist named Paula Hayes, who's exploring the idea of man-made objects and nature and the history of how we interact with nature. The next one, as you arrive, it opens up to something called the Harvest Kitchen, flexibility, optionality, and out to the terrace on Broadway that you're looking at here. When you walk out on that terrace, the next one, this is what we now call Billionaires Row. Ironically, we used to be downtown in Ladies Mile, but they doubled our rent, so we couldn't afford to stay there. So we had to move to a place called Billionaires Row, which is crazy, because it was an obsolete office building. We took that space in the obsolete office building and made these terraces and embedded our studio in the center of Manhattan. But how is the workplace fundamentally different? One of the things we do as the workplace is we're beekeepers. And that might seem like a funny little thing, but it has to do with the culture of place. Like, what does work even mean? So one of the things we do is we're beekeepers. We make honey. We give people honey, and we say, hey, here's honey from 57th Street and Broadway in the center of Manhattan. And people love it. The next one. And it's also a way of educating about our role in a much larger ecosystem. That beekeeping is one that gets you to stop and think about what their life is like and what they're connecting to and the stresses that they're under. And then, of course, you make the direct relationship to the kind of hive mentality and how we work and cooperate as humans. The next one is just a picture of the standard studio. Connected to daylight, connected to plant, and how do we each interact with each other? This all comes back to three things that we built a conviction about the workplace of the future. The next one, please. And we came to a conviction that there were three things that the workplace of the future really needed, and this is pre-COVID. Health and wellness. We need to focus in on the health and wellness component of the workplace. We need to focus in on resiliency and flexibility. And we always get head bobs when we talk about this with somebody. Everybody says, yes, we agree completely. We need to focus in on health and wellness. Absolutely, we need to agree with resilience and flexibility. And interestingly, we also get 100% head bobs when we say, and the workplace needs authenticity. Now, defining authenticity is a little bit trickier. So we had an opportunity to work on a large scale workplace of the future, again, in a repurposed railroad infrastructure. The next one, please. There was a building that was the beginning and the end of the West Side Improvement Project by the New York Central Railroads, which we now call the High Line. This building was built as a place of connection, but not for people, for goods, for rail goods, for shipping, for street. It was all loading docks, all rail sidings. And we had the opportunity to re-envision this as an integral part of Manhattan, a connection to the waterfront, and a workplace of the future. So the first thing we did was cut it away and open it up to the sky for our artery of Houston Street as it connected to the river. So the next one, please. This is the Manhattan waterfront of Gordon Maddox Clark, of cutting buildings and exposing buildings and bringing light in. So we wanted to expose the history, the authenticity of this building as a rail infrastructure, but now repurposed. The developer for this project is a developer named Oxford. They immediately, we did this image for Oxford, and immediately they signed a lease with Google. And now this is a 1.3 million square foot Googleplex. Then we enter through a park. The Houston that used to be blocked by that big infrastructure building is now open to the sky and connecting to Pier 40 and to the Hudson River waterfront. And the next one, please. And a series of optionality, not just how you work, but even how you arrive. The entrance on the left is for Googlers. The entrance on the center is for visitors. But also Manhattan is changing very rapidly in how people get to work. And we created something we call the Garden Alley at the other end of the building, the south end. The next one, please. And this is the Garden Alley. So we're connecting for the first time a street to the waterfront, and we're south of Pier 40 here, looking out on the waterfront. And what you're looking at here on the right is the bike entrance, designed as an alternate front door experience. We're designing the bike entrance for 880 bicycles, the most bicycle parking of any building in the history of Manhattan, because if you build it, we believe people will come. We're about ready to explode bicycle commutation in Manhattan. And all of this was designed pre-pandemic. People ask, what did you change at the Google building post-pandemic? Nothing. This was, all of these things ended up being true. Of course, LEED platinum, of course, MERV 15 filtration, of course, all these other things. Okay. And then I think the other issue is connecting to place. The next one, please. This is the 4th floor terrace. This idea that we all have an innate desire for prospect and refuge. So think about the front porch or every calendar you've ever seen in a sad workplace cubicle. It's from an elevated position, prospecting out onto the horizon and water in the foreground, but refuge behind you. So this idea that there's a protected porch and there's ability to prospect out in the world, to prospect out into the environment. So the next one, I think, is also important. We now view buildings as having much more of a responsibility, and workplace buildings in particular, to be connected to place. So why are we going to leave our homes and go back to work? The genius of human beings is our ability to collaborate and cooperate. Sometimes for great good, sometimes for great evil, but it's our genius. We love getting together. And so the idea of these buildings, if you look here, this is the Googleplex with Oxford as a developer. The next click will be another building we're doing in the neighborhood for Trinity and Norges and Hines, and another building we're doing to the north for Atlas Capital and Westbrook. This idea that each building actually builds a responsibility to place, to connect people from the city through parks and gardens out to our riverfront park and ultimately out to the riverfront. And one little story, when Ben Prosky spoke just a minute ago, over his left shoulder was a book called Manhattan, written by our friend Eric Sanderson. And it talks about Manhattan at the point of first European contact, 1609. And it was this Garden of Eden. And in the book of Genesis, it says that we were put in the Garden of Eden to both work it and take care of it. So even in paradise, we have work and we have responsibility. So for every project we do in Manhattan, Susie Yu is on, she can testify that I bring out Eric Sanderson and Manhattan. What was this place originally before we all came and overworked it like beavers on steroids? What was this place, and how do we get to a regenerative and restorative future? So we did everything we could to have planned a Terrace's flexible workspace. We worked with the landscape architects to do a beautiful landscape that had indigenous species in it. By the time we're finished, I get a call from Eric Sanderson, who calls up and says, "Hey, Rick, I'm on the Google ecology team, and I want to go over every plant species you've planted because Google is really serious about reinforcing the habitat." And we went through and worked the entire planting species list to make sure that we had the best habitat for other species. So it wasn't even thinking about what's the best workplace. And of course, we have automated blinds, a double wall, we have electrochromic, automatically tinting windows, all of that good stuff, a staircase that cuts all the way through that allows you to walk from the penthouse at the top to the ground floor, from the ground floor to the penthouse, meaning you could work and never step into an elevator cab here. But this idea that the workplace is about connection with other people, connection with history, and connection with the vibrant urban fabric that makes us want to get out of our houses and get back to the city. So at the end of the day, we work this puzzle so hard that before we know it, our clients are one step ahead of us, and Eric Sanderson's calling you up and asking to work the puzzle even harder. So it's a really encouraging time, and I think that we have really given a spark to what was already an evolution of the workplace. And we will clearly have a hybrid workplace of the future. I'm an inherent optimist, so I believe that we're going to have better urban workplaces, and we're going to have some optionality to work from our homes at the same time. But at the end of the day, I think we've learned a lot, and we must recommit to what makes our cities beautiful and vibrant and the center for human collaboration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rick, and we look forward to tasting some of your honey. We're now going to have a discussion between our two cities where we'll discuss the future of the office in both those global financial centers. And just to remind you, there is space on the Q&A button for you to put your questions. And so we'll be coming to all our speakers shortly. But to join our panel, we're very pleased to have Kelly Bacon, Global Practice Lead, Workplace Advisory at ACOM, Nick Searle, Partner and Joint Lead for Brent Cross Town. And that's an Argent-related project, which is very interesting in this discussion because, of course, Argent are one of the UK's leading developers, and they're in partnership with Related, who are one of New York's leading developers. So very nice touch there. And then we have Susie Yu, Principal and Head of Development at MAG Partners, or MAG Partners. You can tell me whether I've got it right. So I'm going to invite each of our panelists now to provide their view. And first up, I'll ask Kelly to talk a little bit about behavioral and organizational changes that will transform the workplace and how companies should adapt to these trends. Kelly.
Great, thank you, Peter. And fascinating presentations by both Nick and Rick, and really helps me articulate some of the changes that I think we need to embrace in terms of the evolution of design. And I think in the introduction, we talked about whether or not we're currently in a revolution, but just reminding the entire audience that it has been an evolution for the past few decades in terms of how we approach workplaces. And I particularly love the final quote of the research report from Frank Duffy is, "Never forget the office is neither a very old nor a very stable entity." And some of you may be aware that our team is the legacy DEGW. So of course, quoting Frank Duffy is just appropriate for my response. But some of the things that some of you may be aware from a behavioral perspective, the whole concept of pace layers, and that technology and markets and politics evolve much faster than, quite frankly, cultural and or beliefs. And being and then there's also the geographic culture at play. And being the global practice lead, we often will work with many of our Fortune 500 clients that are looking at sites in New York, London, and Shanghai simultaneously. And it's always so fascinating to me how certain concepts need to be tweaked for those very geographies. But just one of the things to point out in terms of the evolution is that as we've learned as an architecture and engineering and design industry, we have matured over the years. And fundamentally in the, let's say the 70s or 80s, the management style and or the organizational behavior expectations was based on the fact that people would trade their time, energy, and loyalty for stability and longer term careers. And the idea that, you would start in a cubicle, you would start in a bench or start early career, and you would work your way up. And as you got promoted, you would be assigned a private office. Now that made sense at a time where most of our design concepts, where we were allocating about 50% of offices to enclosed spaces. So there was, 50% or 60 or what have you, enclosed spaces so that could be achieved. Well, as we've learned as an industry on the design side, there were fundamental challenges with that approach. It blocked natural light. It made, the HVAC and the air systems tricky to circulate air through the space. And so as we started to evolve from a design perspective, fundamentally the idea that you will start in a cubicle and work your way up to an office just no longer works. So as an evolution, we've had to disconnect and or divorce hierarchy with design. And that's something that culturally is still lingering in terms of that as a challenge or a behavior change. So then when you introduce the idea of activity-based planning, which again is not necessarily a new idea, there's still very much a resistance to that, because that lingering, I started, here and I worked my way up and I am entitled an assigned space, is still a challenge that we have to overcome. And I think at the beginning, someone said, there's concerns about, do we miss this moment in time? And I will share that I am concerned about that, because as people are getting vaccinated, as people are returning, we are starting to see some clients default because it's easier and or, well, this is the way we've done it. And now, now we're safe to continue on that trajectory. So in terms of the behaviors that we need to embrace, the whole idea of no longer managing by presenteeism. And again, these are concepts that the workplace community and the workplace strategy community have been touting for years. But now the world is paying attention more so than I think we have in the past. And the idea of just focusing on activities is a critical component. The idea of hybridity and organizations allowing autonomy, allowing teams to decide when and how they get their work done, but also providing these compelling, amazing spaces to facilitate that in-person connection. And I also think in terms of the continued evolution of design and smart buildings and where we have the potential to go, some of the other additional kind of behavioral organizational changes to embrace is something that our industry began talking about pre-COVID is the idea of neurodiversity, right? The idea of embracing different neurological or psychological profiles, right? And then fundamentally, if you're an introvert, you're going to need or want to limit your stimuli. And whether you do that in a room where you can close the door, you stay home or what have you. And the idea that the psychological profile of extroverts, they're better able to filter out stimuli. And so, understanding that and embracing that, again, it goes back to the idea of just divorcing title, hierarchy, et cetera, from space and embracing space more on a tactical level in terms of what I have to do. There are certain light levels, there are certain environmental stimuli that is supporting. If I'm ideating with a team, there's certain lights and environments that help stimulate that activity versus if I'm doing deep analyses or reading or what have you, there's a different physical environment that supports that. So we know this on an academic and or practitioner level, and we have an interesting opportunity where we need to educate the broader world, if you will, about the benefits that space can have in terms of performance, human performance. and embracing that. The more that we educate our potential clients and the community at large, the better able we are to embrace what we know about biophilic design and smart buildings and integrated sensor networks. And so I think it was Rick that mentioned that he's an optimist. I too am an optimist, but we can't rely on optimism alone. We really have to work to educate on the benefits and or the impact that space has on our neurological and physiological selves and well-being.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. And now we move to Nick. So Nick, can you tell me how Argent Related is adapting to these new working patterns in places that you're developing across London?
Sure, thank you, Peter. Again, great presentations. Thank you to everybody who's done that. I think I'll attempt to try and not repeat too much of what's already been said, but the attitude we're taking is that people are going to need a reason to go to the office. It was mentioned earlier that we've adopted an attitude here that quality of life is going to be the future of work. That's how people are going to think about it. And if going to work is reducing people's quality of life, then they will think twice before they go about it. And before I get into what we as developers can and should do to enable that, there's a couple of higher level points around that. First one is your office, your place of work has got to be easy to get to. And so, because if there is friction in that process, then that immediately starts to dilute people's desire to make that journey, which means that there is huge importance for cities to continue to really invest in public transport. And secondly, for city planners to be thinking about where new office buildings are located, and to work together with the transport authorities to make that a successful relationship. The second thing is that when you go to work, you're not just going to work, you want to do a load of other stuff. You want to meet your friends, you want to do all these other things. So again, in some situations, we as developers have had the opportunity to do very large scale developments where we can help to actually deliver the other stuff. But that's not always true for developers. So for developers working together with city planners to make sure that that mixed use nature of the environments where office and workplace buildings are going is really thought about and embedded is so important. So there's a couple of high level reasons about why people will want to go back to work. I mean, when we come to what we as developers can actually do, there's three areas that we really think about. The first one is actually the physical environment that we can create. The second one is the services and amenities that we can provide for people. And the third thing is the leasing and contractual arrangements. And there is a kind of common theme that I will repeat as we go through those things. And if I just talk about the physical environment first, the first thing is flexibility. We have to maximize flexibility, and we have to make it extremely cost effective for people to be able to adapt space over time, because needs are going to change. We actually don't know today what it's going to look like in 12 months. We certainly don't know what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years. So actually less is more in a way, and we need to make sure that these spaces are simple and easy to adapt. Digital connectivity is going to be utterly critical. We have to make that utterly seamless. It has to be just basic hygiene that it works brilliantly. We want all of these spaces to be low carbon, both in terms of embedded and in terms of their operational carbon, because that actually just makes people feel good. It makes people proud, as well as the obvious other benefits. It makes people, it's another reason why people want to come. The technical side of things with air quality, fresh air, what are we doing with opening windows? How many more outdoor spaces can developers actually afford to deliver and not rentalize? The greening of those spaces, we've talked all about those. So all of those are really important considerations for us in terms of how we bring forward that physical environment. And then when we talk about amenities and services, I'm going to start again with flexibility. And the reason I start with flexibility is because part of the reason that we want to bring additional amenities and services here isn't just to have more amenities and services. It's actually to provide more service to people to allow them to live more flexible lives. So when they come to work, they can do other things too. And that's whether that's through concierge service or other services that are within the building or around the building. We need to make sure that those services actually operate longer, because we think people's working hours are going to differ. Some people are going to want to come earlier and go home later, and they're going to, want to work in a more dynamic kind of way. So extending some of the hours that those things are available, providing communal spaces within our buildings so that there are places for this collaboration that we're all talking about, but not every single occupier in every single building has to provide their own. There are some that we would provide where people can come and actually do that, and that reduces people's cost, but they still get the benefit of those kinds of arrangements. And then the last point is around the lease arrangements, and I will start once again with flexibility. It's the same point. People don't quite know what they're going to need in a few years' time. So we've got to look at, we expect that lease lengths are going to continue to reduce. But we've got to think very carefully about how we structure leases in the future. We've got to think carefully about, a lot of people in London now are talking to us about core and flex type arrangements, where they want a core of space that they will take for the long term. And then they want other space around that they can have on shorter, more flexible terms. So they can flex in and out of it based upon what actually happens in their future. I think we've got to actually be providing, whether it be us as developers providing it ourselves or partnering with serviced office operators, we need some of that space that business can pay for to expand into and out of as well. We're not within one building going to be able to provide as much flexibility as every organisation would like. So we need to partner with the flex operators and the serviced operators to provide some of that flexibility. Green leases are going to be really important. So we've got to think very carefully about all of that. But at the heart of all of those things is a more flexible relationship between the landlord, the developer, the landlord, the tenant, but also through the institutional investor as well. This only works if the funding that is provided for these buildings actually accepts that, certainly in London, everything's not going to be a 25-year lease. And actually, we have to work with a different format of leasing arrangements going forward. It doesn't all change overnight. None of this is going to happen overnight. But it is a direction of travel that we all, as a community within the property industry, have to work on together. And as I say, that goes right from an investor funder through to when we're working with our architect partners to be really thinking about how these floors can be split up more easily, more flexibly, how we can create relationships between floors vertically, and all the rest of it. And the last thing I would say is that what I'm conscious always doing when I'm talking to corporate occupiers, and I'm talking to the people who run those organizations, is I am trying to give them the tools to talk to their own staff and their own potential new staff. And all the feedback that we've had over the last 6 to 12 months talking to occupiers is that the three things that are most important to the staff that are coming in are health and well-being, a low carbon future, diversity and inclusivity. And so we are looking at how our buildings can enable corporate organizations to deliver on those aspirations for their staff.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. And now, Susie, perhaps you can tell us how are developers adapting in New York to these new ways of working, and how do you think this is going to transform neighborhoods across the city?
So I think in New York, what has been very interesting is that there's been a surge of new leasing activity, especially in the newer buildings that are currently under development. Buildings like, I hate to actually talk about other developers' buildings, but buildings like One Vanderbilt, right? is almost fully leased. And I think they were very smart in recognizing where the market was and leasing up a huge amount of space. And building, the other building is 425 Park Avenue that was designed by Sir Norman Foster. That building also has seen a tremendous amount of leasing activity. And where you see the majority of the leasing activity in New York City are to the newer buildings that has the health and wellness component, the upgraded HVAC, which I think is really important, touchless pathways, you know, all the things that the designers have been talking about for last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, that developers are a little bit later to adapt to because it has to make financial sense. But I think now you can underwrite to those, and tenants are looking for that type of experience in order to recruit and retain talent, right? Because right now, I think what most people are seeing is there is a tremendous hesitancy in people coming back to work full time, even though larger organizations like JP Morgan, Blackstone have said that by fall, you know, they're going to call everyone back into the office. So New York is really gearing up to be in sort of full occupancy mode. But right now, we're probably at about 15 to 20% occupancy. It is extraordinary when you go to Midtown, where Rick's office is, and you walk down 6th Avenue, 5th Avenue, and it feels like day after Christmas. It's so empty, right? It's very bizarre. And I feel really sad as a New Yorker when I go to those, but then, you know, 20 blocks south near Madison Square Park, Union Square, where the older buildings are, that's much less dense and heavily focused on office. Those neighborhoods feel very vibrant, you know? I mean, New York City has undergone this transformation where all of the restaurants have taken over the streets, and it's fantastic, right? You see people dining and people are working outside, right? And I think what has changed is with the lifting of the restrictions here, people are going out and working at a lot of different places, right? We don't think of work is only taking place in our home or desks anymore. And so, you know, you can go to the park, you can go to the cafe, and you see people just kind of like doing work throughout the day, and it just, everything becomes portable, right? And it's very different. And I think it's sort of made people engage with their neighborhoods more, which I think is really fantastic, right? Especially those of us who have stayed through in the city through COVID. So looking at where I think will be interesting for New York is as vaccination continues to increase, right, over the summer. And then in the fall, we'll see what happens on when we're quote unquote 70% back to the office, and how that sort of translates. I do think that New York's office occupancy will go up, but I think you'll see much more activity in the newer buildings. And I do think that there's going to be a increase in also residential occupancy because people are now moving back into the city. All those 400,000 people who left New York City during the height of the pandemic are starting to move back in droves, you know? So when you look at like new leases signed in New York City, just Manhattan, it was like over 9,000 leases in April. That's a tremendous amount of activity. So I think it's slowly getting there. It's going to continue to pick up momentum. And then once actually the Midtown population fills in, I think the city's going to feel very different. And I also think there's so much opportunity for landlords and developers at the ground plane, reimagining those ground plane, those shutter retail spaces, and interesting, more sustainable type of retail experiences that's like shorter terms of leases will come in and take those spaces, because I think, you know, the landlords are now, I would say, have gotten religion. They're not going to get $500 a square foot in rent. So let's really look at that in a different light and put in a little bit more interesting operator at ground, maybe even a completely different use. So I think New York specifically is going to see a lot of transformation at the ground plane, fundamentally, I believe, as an urban fabric for next 2 years. It really has to change. So it's an exciting time. I mean, we are so, you know, we're a 3-year-old firm. So we're a very young 25-year-old development company in the making, but we're only 3 years old, and we're working on 3 new development projects, and we have a boutique office building that we're designing also with Rick. And so there's so much activity in the market, and I feel like everyone is just sort of like, you know, putting their feet on the gas, just like ready to go. And I think it's going to be a really exciting next 2 years.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's a very optimistic view. Perhaps I could ask, though, that you talk about the streets feeling rather empty, and at least in parts of New York at the moment. And one of the issues that we are concerned about in London is that the commercial damage done to restaurants, bars, and cultural organisations will actually reduce some of the benefits of being in the centre, and that will have a negative impact on those people who might otherwise be attracted to work in the centre, because the amenities have just you know, vanished because of the commercial pressure they've been under.
Well, the residential areas in New York City, the restaurants taking over the sidewalks and streets, the vibrancy is there. It's really, I think the reason that Midtown feels so empty is because the office workers are not there, you know, to really go to those restaurants. And I think once the office workers come back to Midtown, I think it's going to feel very different. And those restaurants will open, new restaurants will open. You know, I actually went to the Botanical Gardens 2 weeks ago out in Bronx to look at the Kusama exhibit, and it was full. And it was like a dreary, rainy day. So people are going to museums. A friend sent me a photo from the Nets game yesterday from Barclays Center, and it was packed. You know, they have sections for vaccinated people. So people are out and about. And I think it's just, I think there is a sense of emptiness in Midtown Manhattan because there is lack of office workers. Now, it may feel different. I'm actually going up to Rick's office today for a design meeting. So I'm hoping that it's actually better. And I can report back if you like.
Very good, thank you. So Nick, how about you? Because you've got feet in both camps, really. You have the King's Cross development, which is sort of central London, and of course where you are, it's a bit further out, where you're developing now. How do you see this sort of shift in and out of the centre at the moment?
It's been really interesting actually, because there was a period where for our New York friends, there was a period where we had total lockdown, really, from January, February, and March. But from April onwards, King's Cross has actually started to get really quite busy, and that was even before the shops opened. And we were, you know, looking at central London at the time, Oxford Street and other areas, and it really was desolate in April, going into early May. And I think, you know, we came to realise that the nature of the public spaces that we had created at King's Cross were a great attractor to people just to come and be. And they're large. You can have quite a lot of people there. You don't feel particularly packed together. It's not a park, it is an urban space. And, you know, we were starting to sell takeaway coffees and things like that. So we realized it was still being used as a meeting place, as a gathering place. We actually had to, in the early days, close off some areas where people were kind of gathering a little bit too closely at the time. But, you know, that there's a lot of lessons in there about what people value in terms of public space. So that's been really important. I do think that you know, central London has got, as I'm sure with New York, has got a really big task on its hand to give those reasons to come back. And I think our city planners, city authorities, and our businesses have got to work together to actually bring forward new, interesting activation events, as well as looking at the longer term. How do we actually replace much of the retail that we're going to be losing? In terms of looking at a newer development, we're looking at a very large scale, a whole town. It's 10 million square feet. It's on the sort of outer edges of central London. And we're thinking about that very much again in terms of how many reasons can we give people to be there? And how many of those reasons are reasons that they won't have to go to other places? You basically have to ask yourself, what is it you can't do on the internet? And when you think about shops in particular and activities, you have to think quite locally. You have to think about what is relevant to that place so that the people who are there actually find that it's relevant to them. You're not just targeting a sort of slightly amorphous person who could come from anywhere. And through doing that, you actually create real identity, and that identity then becomes interesting to other people from further afield. So I think that's, you know, thinking through what localism really means and how you can actually play localism out at scale and meaningfully, such that it's attractive to a lot of people, is a big part of how we're approaching that.
Thanks. And Kelly, perhaps I could ask you, with your global experience, how is this, might say, almost conflict between inner cities and outer areas shaping up in other cities? We heard, I think, fairly optimistic view from Susie. Is that other cities, are they seeing the same, do you think?
I would say so. And there is this, you know, going back to the cultural or the behavioral shift, we are seeing, you know, with the acceptance of, or the forced acceptance of remote working being viable, but also recognizing, you know, that people are eager to get back with colleagues and get back with people. There's this shift of it going from the grind, right? If you have a lengthy commute and you're doing it 5 days a week, and no matter how much you love your coworkers or your space or whatnot, that repetition becomes tiresome. So with the shift and the acceptance of hybridity, and we have been doing quite a bit of research with Mercer, which is a human resources consulting firm, to really understand where and what organizations are thinking and what their hybrid structure would look like. When we see that, you know, the acceptance of it being 2 to 3 days a week, you know, the tolerance for a longer commute is there, right? So that's, you know, kind of going back to, you know, the sprawl, if you will, the suburban sprawl. But to the point that was made previously about connecting these cores with transportation and the movement back into cities. So, you know, we're just seeing this movement all over, but from a cultural perspective, you know, the allowance of it being a couple days a week is making it more intentional, and or, you know, I'm going in because I want to, as opposed to because I need to. And there's a genuine excitement. You know, there's certainly still a concern about health and safety. There's a concern specifically with folks that have relocated and now are further away from that center. We are working with one organization right now. We're working with our real estate economics team in terms of a portion of their campus. We're doing the financial modeling to turn that into residential, so that this campus, which was outside of the urban core, just keep that in mind, you know, has the ability to bring folks back, whether it's on a monthly or quarterly cadence, so that they can have that in-person culture building. But then the same organization, as we're modeling that, we're modeling various distributed hubs in the urban center, so that the folks that would potentially do the reverse commute also have a place to go in the city. So it's, you know, and those analyses that we're doing is driven by what we're hearing from their staff and what and how they want to continue to work. And so, I'm really optimistic about that. The third tier, of course, and this may deviate from your question, Peter, but the third tier is really how you design and integrate technology into those places. So the idea that whether, I live in downtown Manhattan, I'm going to the hub, versus the reverse commute out to New Jersey, where this campus is, but also connecting with my colleagues, I need to be able to connect, again, in person, but also have my virtual colleagues, somehow, virtually present, right? And making that more seamless so that it's less, because that's one of the things that the organizations are struggling with. What is the structure? How do you discern, well, Tuesdays and Thursdays, these folks are coming in, and if you create enabling technological infrastructure, then you don't have to structure it from a people or personnel perspective as strongly as some organizations are implying, because again, it becomes a seamless interaction.
Yeah.
So that's one example of how we're handling it.
Thank you. And well, Nick and Rick, perhaps I could move to you now, because I mean, it's interesting. Susie mentioned, newer buildings are attractive because of, they've got HCV, non-touch panel controls, all that, sort of stuff that you need in a post-COVID environment. But of course, I mean, Nick, you've been involved with actually refitting a major building. And you talked about sort of flexibility and rethinking business parks, that sort of thing. I mean, there is and we're seeing quite a lot of new buildings going up right in the centre of London at the moment. But there's a huge role, isn't it, to now refit and repurpose existing buildings.
There is, yeah, and obviously there's the existing offices themselves. I think that obviously for decades, we've looked at historic Victorian warehouses and things and sort of, transformed those. But what we're seeing more and more, and so the business parks thing is part of this, is that the sort of more recent structures that maybe aren't that exciting, they're not obvious structures for saving, actually, still have some value. And part of that is obviously embodied carbon. It's making sure we're not demolishing things that we don't need to, and we're demolishing structures that are viable. But actually, it's also, you can sort of intervene in certain ways that can completely transform buildings that might not be the sort of prettiest buildings on the block, but actually, suddenly make them far more viable, far more attractive. So I think, there's huge opportunities to sort of rethink structures that maybe 30 years ago we'd just demolish and sort of start again. And that's obviously completely apart from the fact that we need to, even existing office spaces, we need to sort of rethink and start to adapt to sort of current trends.
And Rick, that's happening in New York. It's not all new building.
Yes, and I think what we're getting into right now is what's not visible. So air filtration, bipolar ionization, the quality of the water, and all of these things are not necessarily visible. But what's also happening is we're diving back deeper and we're telling different stories. And one of the issues we didn't really talk about, but it's also an issue very present in New York and all around the world, are the issues of social equity. And one of the issues, talking about Euro history, obviously European descent, white guy, is social equity issues. When you talk about caring about the environment, what goes paired exactly with it, hand in hand, are issues of social equity. So we start on things like material transparency and these invisible things. So it's very easy for me to talk to somebody and say, we don't want to bring materials into your workplace that will off-gas poisons and make you sick. And everybody says, yeah, that's a good idea, Rick. That's good. And then you say, well, it's not so bad. Maybe your kids crawl on the couch and we don't want them to get sick because their breathing zones are so close. And everybody agrees. That's a good idea, Rick. We should make sure we don't make our kids sick, new lungs and all of that. But then you go, hey, these materials, all these things we make, they are being made someplace, and those people are in incredibly tight quarters making these materials. And if they have toxicity and off-gassing in our place, what are they doing at the place of manufacture? So then now you're a little bit more uncomfortable and you're at the place of manufacture. Then you say, where are those places of manufacture? What neighborhoods are they in? And what are the emissions from that workplace doing to the neighborhood? What are the asthma rates around these places where places are made? And then you continue to peel back the onion through material transparency, and you are at raw materials. And now you're on a global scale. And now you go from London and New York, and you're going to other places with very poor control of the labor market. And the next thing you know, you're at child labor, forced labor, modern day slavery. And I'd like to make a shameless plug for Grace Farms and the Design for Freedom Project, a not-for-profit that's, I think, doing the best work to try to peel back the veil on forced labor in the material supply chain. I think it's the kind of thing that people care about. They don't really know their air quality is better. We tell them that it is, and they feel it and they feel better. But people also want to know that when they go to a place, people care about more than the last dollar per square foot in rent or the highest level of productivity. What does this company care about? What is their mandate for making the world a better place? And as we dig deeper in material transparency, we come right back to social equity. So I think that these things are very important when we tell the stories about building new buildings, or we tell the stories about how we're renovating existing buildings, or how we're re-envisioning our cities. The issue of how we treat each other and the horrific stories of what we've done to each other over time and how we're going to fix that is also now all of a sudden bound up into this issue of architecture and design in the workplace.
So, well, we do have a question along those lines. Say, how are new activism, awareness, commitments to social equity and social justice shaping the workplace futures in London, New York? So how will that actually impact on the work you're doing to deliver new or refurbished buildings in the city? What are the actual impacts that sort of change in attitude has?
Well, it's really, for me, about marketplace transformation. In the early days, almost 20 years ago now, we were able to transform the marketplace for concrete in New York because we're involved in the green building movement. So as an example, 1 ton of cement produces 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we started using cement substitutes in our buildings, first at Battery Park City, then at One Bryant Park, and reducing hundreds of thousands of metric tons of carbon production because of that. But what really happened, if you picture the concrete industry in New York, just picture everything you've ever heard about the concrete industry in New York City, picture that for a second. You are 100% correct, that mental picture. It's an industry that's resistant to change. We changed it. We transform the marketplace. The concrete industry loves the new cement substitutes. The concrete sets up harder and faster. So what I'm saying now about how do we do it, now that we know, we can't unknow about the supply chain. And what we can do is think about our ethical practices in employment. That's one thing. Our policies as employers, the impact that our actions have on other people, and all the way back to the supply chain and what it's doing globally with other people. We have a global responsibility as global citizens to think about these things. And this is now very much in the forefront, and we all can talk about it. And it means it's another reason we might want to come back together and collaborate, because we can have more power doing good together than we can individually.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got a question here. What's the future of businesses and workers not lucky enough to work in well-designed and beautiful environments on the other side of COVID-19? And that's a question from Vicky Evans in Melbourne. I don't know if there's anyone who'd like to respond to that. No, right, no answers to that one. We'll go on to the next.
I would say something. I mean,
all right,
I think,
okay, good.
yeah,
Thank you,
I think
Ben.
it's interesting, right? We've got designers, we've got people here, but actually, I think it's back on the worker a little bit. Like, what did you all do in your homes, right? Were all your homes these ideal, beautiful environments to work in? Maybe they were nice for you, but you had to make something. So I think something has to come together between the controlled environments that are provided to people when they go back to the office, and how much leverage do they have, right? Can you open a window? Can you bring a plant in? can you do some of the things that make you feel comfortable? Or are the spaces so heavily regulated? I think it's not all on the designers and owners and not all on the workers. I think there's something about an understanding about how we each contribute to our environment and how much leverage can we build in, or flexibility. Nick Searle, I really appreciated you're referring to flexibility. And I think that there's so much of this flexibility that I'm thinking about even in our own environment at the Center for Architecture, but design flexibility, financial flexibility, all of these things are what make people feel like they have a little more control and at ease. And so I think these are really good challenges for us to think about now.
And Peter, I'd like to jump in too to the viewer's question from Melbourne. When we talk about marketplace transformation, one of the things that's constant for all of us talking about is recruitment and retention of talent. To get the best talent, to retain the best talent. That's a marketplace. If you look at the expense of a company, the expense of a company is not in rent. It is not in energy, as much as we attack those things. The expense of every company is predominantly personnel expenses. From 2/3 to 3/4 of every company is personnel expenses. So when we do something that's better for energy, we're making a tiny change. When we do something better for the people, we're making a big change. So ultimately, what we need to do, at all of us as a community, is put pressure. Talk to your employer about the quality of space that you expect to return. That's going to change the marketplace, and people are going to go to buildings and complexes like Nick is designing, as opposed to the complexes that don't care about this, that might be an off price. Frankly, the tiny amount of additional costs it takes to do buildings of high quality is more than paid for with people coming back to the office and being happy about it and feeling engaged again. So I would say that your viewer from Melbourne, be part of the marketplace transformation. The poor buildings will have to get renovated, as Nick talked about, and the best buildings will be designed to meet the needs of a higher standard of care.
Thank you very much. Now we've got a question here from Ben Adams. He says, as one of the largest cities by area and least dense cities in the world, what advice would our NYLON speakers give to Los Angeles as it catches up through creating more density, delivering mass transportation and mixed use buildings and hybridization? Anyone like to tell LA what they ought to be doing?
Peter, I'll have a little try. I think the answer is in the question, isn't it? Because it talks about densification, it talks about hybridization, it's all of those things. I'm no expert on Los Angeles, but density in the world of urban development was often talked about as a negative, and it absolutely is. Density actually provides energy. It creates community. And so actually focusing effort into particular areas to create that density and to create the vibrancy and the mix of uses that come with that is a really important part of it. When you've got any city that is spread too thinly, that puts different activities in different zones, the CBD is dead. End. There is no such thing anymore. When I first worked in London in 1982, the City of London, you went to work, you left, and that's the same for American cities. That's what Canary Wharf when it was first designed, and they're still trying to get out of that hole today. So there is no such thing as a CBD. Everything is about mixing those uses. Los Angeles is in such a beautiful place. You'd think, actually you've got all the natural assets there to make that look incredibly well. So I think it's just, I think density is actually at the heart of it. It's spread too thin.
If I could jump in and make a quick point as well, and we've actually got an LA office, Hawkins Brown Architects, which is sort of growing. So we have a team who understand the city far better than I do. I'm not an expert, as Nick sort of said as well. But I think my sense, looking at sort of opportunities and projects there, is that there are developers doing really interesting things and architects doing really interesting things at a sort of individual building or plot level, but maybe that it's not being kind of stitched together. There needs to be more sort of connecting the dots, and whether that's, you know, someone like Nick and, you know, urgent related and a sort of developer who can take on a slice of city and kind of master plan a larger area, or whether it's, you know, local government being having a more coherent plan for the future of an area. I think, you know, there perhaps needs to be more kind of joining of the dots and kind of larger scale thinking. But again, you know, I'm not an expert on Los Angeles, and that's just an outsider's view, I suppose.
And following up on that, density enables public transportation. And I think the problem with LA very much is the necessity of getting into your car to go everywhere. And without public transportation, it's very hard to create these networks. And I think the public transportation is coming because of development and density in certain areas. But certainly there could be more of it.
Yeah, thank you. And now, just for a last question here, it says, interesting to hear Nick refer to inter-neighbourhood competition between King's Cross and, say, Oxford Street in attracting people back rather than buildings as such. Now, each district has different assets and vulnerabilities. What scope is there for local governance arrangements in each area to rise to this challenge? Either local government, business improvement districts, community-based organizations. What are those things that are going to make the difference? What's driving that? In I mean, we borrowed business improvement districts from New York, and obviously the Times Square was a great example, which we followed and has been very useful in London in terms of energizing districts which had pretty disparate governance before that. Who would like to say anything about how we encourage people back into central areas?
Peter,
No?
could I just say one thing quickly? Could I say one thing quickly, Peter? What has been very, very noticeable, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is how much the speed of action of local authorities during the lockdown periods to enable car-bound streets to behave and exist in a different way. I live near Brighton on the south coast of the city, of the UK, about an hour outside London. And literally during lockdown, they have extended all of the narrow streets and pavements. All of the pavements have been extended between 1 metre and 1.5 metres. And what that has done is changed all the traffic flows and reduced the speed and the number of cars. And it has created the opportunity for seating on all of the narrow streets around there. So, you know, if you tried to get that through in any normal time, it would have taken years of rancor and argument. But in a crisis, we responded. Everybody responded because they had no choice. The same kind of things happened on certain streets in Soho where they got closed down and cars were banned, and some of it's sticking. And I think we've really got to look at what happened during that moment of, in inverted commas, crisis, and learn from it and be more prepared to take what look like really difficult decisions. But actually, once you've taken them, you kind of wonder why you didn't do it 20 years ago. And we are scared to make big decisions, and there's too many vested interests that are stopping us making good decisions about our city centres.
Although I have to say, I'm also interested in more structural changes that might happen, and I've been fascinated for some time with the impact that 9/11 had on the planning of Lower Manhattan and the more mixed-use environment that was delivered there, and that's quite interesting in the context of a debate a couple of weeks ago when the City of London, which are our equivalent to Wall Street, totally a business area, very dead at weekends and so on, there was a suggestion in the Financial Times that they were going to convert and permit office buildings to move to more residential, and the city authorities denied that that was the case, thinking it was a really bad thing. But isn't what has happened to Lower Manhattan quite a positive thing since 9/11? Coming out of that tragedy, actually, it created a very different sort of city. And was that a positive change? Perhaps one of the New Yorkers would comment on that for me before we close.
I think Lower Manhattan, after 9/11, it really transformed himself, right? There were tax incentive in place to promote residential development and conversions of the older office buildings into residential, which really created a much more thriving population in Lower Manhattan than there was before. And I think because of that thriving residential population in redevelopment as well as new development has also allowed for the World Trade Center buildings that's being built currently. And the last site actually that Port Authority RFP, they're taking the old Deutsche building, Deutsche Bank building, and allowing for a residential use, even though they would have to go through what we would call a new entitlement, because that use was not allowed as part of it. So I think the mixing, in New York, I do think planning has been a little bit much more aggressive in creating these mixed use districts, where you have uses like office, residential, light industrial, makerspace, and land uses become much more community-based process, where the community really has to buy in. They become part of that process for a successful entitlement to be completed. So it's a very different type of thing, where even, for us, it's a lot of the large industrial opportunities, manufacturing, and then all of those are being rezoned as MXs, which allows for mixed use. So I think, we talk about words like regenerative, restorative, sustainable, authenticity. All of those things really promote, to work, live, and play. That's really what we want to do. We want to go, right, out to dinner in our neighborhood. I love the fact that I can bike 5 minutes to my office, right? And that's like the ultimate dream, I think. We want to really promote the communities that we live in and spend our money there.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Well, since the British government is hoping to pass a new planning system, which will be much more zoning related in the future, so it'd be interesting to see whether we follow some of that pattern in London in the future. So anyway, thank you all very much. It's always great fun and fascinating, and really great to exchange views with you all in New York, and today is no exception. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks for being with us and joining in, and thank you to our champions, our collaborators, and particularly to Ben for being our link to the other side of the Atlantic. So thank you all very much, and wishing you all success as we emerge from the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.